This video is going to be a series on atonement, all right? And the way I want to start this series is really simple. I want to take you to Wikipedia, where there's, basically a really simple view or look at all of the different models of atonement so that we can simply and basically understand what is atonement, all right? Or at least what are the theories of atonement. Primarily, we're going to be looking at it from a Protestant perspective because I'm a Protestant. So this is atonement in Christianity. You can go there from an article, on Wikipedia. Just go to atonement in Christianity. Here's what you're going to find. The word atonement, okay, focus real quick. If we're going to talk about atonement, we've got to define atonement. But we're going to define it in English and we're going to define it in Hebrew. The word atonement, often used in the Old Testament to translate Hebrew words, kippur, kippurim. These words are pretty much from the same root, kippur, which means propitiation or expiation. Those are some of the ways, a couple, that they are used in English, words that you can probably look at in English and see the meaning. The English word atonement originally meant at one mint, being at one or in harmony with something. According to Collins' English Dictionary, it's used to describe the saving work that God did through Christ to reconcile the world to himself, and also of the state of a person having been reconciled to God. Okay, so we use this word in English, atonement. And the word atonement that we use in English, at one mint, is a general term that kind of describes the whole concept of what Christ has done in the Bible, in his work of reconciling or reconciliation. And so when you look at when you're looking in the Bible and you see the word reconciling in the New Testament, you can kind of get the general concept or the idea that we're talking about atonement, the idea of making us back to one. But before we do that, I want to also look at this Hebrew word, actually in the Hebrew. Now, if you want to look at Hebrew words and you want to see them next to their English counterparts, you can go to this really great tool, Blue Letter Bible, and you can see all of the Greek and the Hebrew words and the Septuagint and other ways to see the actual original languages and stuff. And it makes it really simple as well. So the word here, kippur, or the primitive root kafar, is used 102 times in the King James Version Bible, this particular word. And you'll see the different usages, how it's used when it's translated these 102 times. One time it's atonement, another time it's the word purge, another time it's reconciliation or reconcile, forgive, purge away, pacify, atonement. And then, so where do we get this? Well, in the different Hebrew tenses, which is like Cal and ours would be like present tense, right? And then you have like different tenses in Hebrew, like past and future, and there's participles, and I'm not going to get into all of that. Nonetheless, this is how the translation is when you see it in these tenses most frequently. To cover, purge, make an atonement, make reconciliation, cover over with pitch. So there's really only one major usage of it. And then with each tense, it changes slightly. To coat or cover with pitch, to cover over, pacify, propitiate, to cover over, atone for sin, make atonement for, to cover over, atone for sin and persons by legal rights, to be covered over, to make atonement for, to be covered. Okay, so you have a general usage. This is mainly how it's being, the substance from which it's being translated. All right, so now let's just look at, you can, I'm not going to do this, but you can look at the lexicon usage. So in each verse, it breaks down a basic usage of each one. Now, is this 100% accurate? No, these are what, whoever did this lexicon, who is it? It's Brown Driver Briggs, and there's other lexicons by other people. This one I think is probably public domain, which is why they're able to use it. But essentially what you see here is you see the way that they've determined how it should be used in each one of the verses. Are they 100% accurate? They would hope to be, but probably not, because they're just doing the best they can. And I'm not going to point out any inaccuracies. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying you can rely upon lexicons to a very strong extent, but they're not always 100%. Because what they're doing is they're taking these words and they're comparing them with other words. The other times that this word is being used in the Bible, they're understanding its context, and then they're after they've taken the word and they've defined it and they've understood the context of the word, then they'll compare it with other documents and letters and things that maybe have nothing to do with the Bible, or secular or other religious documents and stuff during that same time, to be able to derive meaning when they see that same word being used in those other documents. And they can say, oh, okay, I can see it was used like this by contemporaries of that time in this way. And then they can start making applications of that word in each one of these circumstances and stuff. And this is a big work. And so these guys are doing a lot of work when they're going through and doing this stuff. And these are Christians of all variety, and even probably there's a lot of non-Christians that are doing this work as well. And maybe not the biblical work, but with the documents that aren't the biblical documents, or maybe Christian documents, or even Jewish documents, or things like that. They might be translating those, which go into being able to translate these words. And so now you have an idea of where words like this come from. So the concept generally of the word atonement in the Old Testament, which is where we really get a lot of our theology of atonement originating, especially when it's talking about the sanctuary and stuff, because so much in the Old Testament the word atonement was used to talk about the function of what the animals would do, the animal sacrifices, and the whole sanctuary system, and God's model and stuff, what that would happen. And then the New Testament explains that even further for Christians, so they can understand more of the applications of that Old Testament sanctuary, things that were fulfilled in Christ. Okay, so now we're getting this word atonement, right? Well, after we see this word atonement, then we start seeing these models, okay, of atonement coming up, and these theories of atonement, all right? So let's skip down and let's start looking at each one of these different theories of atonement. The first one we're going to look at here is called ransom from Satan. Now, a lot of people are really specific, like, I believe in this model of atonement or this model of atonement. One you'll hear a whole lot is penal substitution, and we'll talk about that one. That's one of the models of atonement. But as we talk about each one of these models of atonement, I want you to know that I believe that there's probably some overlap to each one of these models, and there's definitely Bible texts that these people have gotten these ideas from. They've inferred these models of atonement from legitimate Bible texts. So say, for example, the ransom from Satan theory. The theory goes that Christ liberated humanity from slavery to sin and Satan. Is that in the Bible? Well, you better believe it's in the Bible. Did Christ liberate mankind from sin? According to Romans chapter 6, it says that he did. It says that you have been freed from sin. You who, Galatians chapter 5, you once were slaves, now you've been adopted as, or Galatians chapter 4, now you've been adopted as sons, okay? So there's this idea, well, were we ever Satan's domain? Again, you start looking at Bible texts like Matthew chapter 4, where Satan takes Christ up onto the mountain and shows him the kingdoms of the world and says, these are all mine, and I will give them to you if you bow down to me. And Christ doesn't argue with him. He doesn't say, those aren't yours, you're acting like they're yours, but they're not yours. He doesn't say that at all. He says you should worship God alone, showing his allegiance to God. And so there are texts that people infer this information from. And this is a fairly old theory of atonement, that Satan had authority on the earth. He had his grip on humanity, and Christ made it possible, or made a way to remove Satan's grip on humanity and set us free from Satan and sin. Is there truth to this? Absolutely. How far? how deep into the model do you believe, or which one of the nuances would you say no to? I don't believe that, but definitely some of the major theme, you know, some of the major themes you can accept and you can kind of understand and see that they're true. Now, there's a difference between saying, yeah, I can definitely believe in the ransom model versus saying, yeah, I can definitely believe in some of the themes and ideas that are in the ransom model that I can see as biblical. Okay, so there's a big difference between that. And so you might reject the theory proper, right? But you might accept some of the ideas that come along inside of it, or some of the theory that's inside of it, some of the themes and that sort of thing. Well, the next one that we come to is the, well, I guess we can talk for a moment about the recapitulation theory. All right. This was basically similar to the ransom theory, but it focuses on Christ being the second Adam. And it says that Christ succeeded where Adam failed, and he undid the wrongs that Adam had done. Because of his union with humanity, he's able to lead humanity to eternal life, including moral perfection. And we definitely can see some of this and believe some of this to be true. Christ was a second Adam. Christ was uniting humanity with divinity because he was the God-man. He was a restoring link, a reconciling link. And so in that sense, we can really say, oh yes, there's parts of the recapitulation theory that we believe in. Now, whether you believe in all of the parts, again, you have to study it more in depth to see whether you do believe in that. There's other theories that started coming along a little bit later. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't exist before. Usually the people that wrote these or codified them or maybe organized them, when they look back, they say, hey, this was all throughout church history, regardless of what the theory is. They're saying that this was the main theory throughout church history, which may or may not be true, but that's their perspective. So we're getting into a theory now called satisfaction theory. Now, this one is a very interesting theory, and I think it causes a lot of it's hard to sit on the fence with this one. You usually fall on one side or the other, whether you believe it. And I would say the majority of people have chosen to reject the satisfaction theory. The reason is because it makes God out to be someone who is primarily focused on restoring his honor. And that almost like I'm only worried that people will think bad things about me, and so I'm going to kill them for that. Oh, then Christ steps in and he says, well, I can defend your honor because I'm honorable. And he gets killed instead, and God is satisfied by the death of Christ. This is a little too petty, almost, in my opinion, it's a little too petty that it's so focused on the honor of God. Now, was God's honor, had it been offended? Had God's honor been offended? Well, absolutely, his honor was offended by humanity's sin and the angelic sin. Definitely, God's honor was offended. Does that mean that God then was, out to defend his honor, or is there more to the story than that? And that's probably the situation, is that there's more to the story than that. There's probably a component of the fact of God's name, his reputation, his honor needing to be restored, for sure. But I don't know if you would want to build your entire theory around that. And I don't know that that was God's main intent, to restore his honor. Maybe one of the largest current Protestant models of atonement is penal substitution. It's maybe the most broadly believed, but it's also the most, probably the most argued, meaning there's a lot of accusations against it as well. And we'll talk about some of those in just a minute. But penal substitution was, again, if we're going to say, put together, organized by somebody, you would say probably, Martin Luther and John Calvin and some of these reformers who came along, and they said, hey, this was the model originally, as they all did, throughout church history, and this is what it really looks like. Others disagree. Others say this wasn't the model throughout church history, although there have always been statements through the church fathers that speak about the concept of there being a legal component. This is also often called the forensic theory. Even though there was throughout history a legal component that's often discussed when talking about, by the church fathers when talking about atonement, it doesn't mean that this was what they were thinking, that what Martin Luther and what John Calvin wrote, that the whole model that they organized was what they were thinking. I think everybody would agree that you can see legal language in the church fathers, in their writings and stuff. And what do we mean by church fathers? They're just all of the church leaders throughout, the 2,000 years since the first church was here. So these church fathers wrote about all sorts of different things, and some of them supported all different models of the atonement. So penal substitution, though, that was kind of organized and put together by a couple lawyers, and they, as you can imagine, lawyers are kind of focused on legal models of things, and so they really built out a robust legal model of atonement, which most Christians now fully adopt. And not only a legal model, but specifically, and this is really important, they built out a model that was highly penal. So what does that mean? Well, the word penal is simply just like a shortened word for penalty. The concept is that because of sin, mankind was going to have to receive the penalty of sinning. Let's say that God says, you shall not do such and such. Well, if you break that known law, or if you go against God, then you will be receiving whatever the penalty for that is. And for all who go against God, the penalty is death. So if you go against God, you will die. And not only is it focused on that, but it's also largely focused on God's wrath. So the idea that if you break God's law, he's angry at you, and then he must do something about that, and so he must kill you in order for his wrath to be pacified or satisfied or to go away, right? So this is largely the concept of penal substitution, and again, I think it's probably the most widely believed by Protestants. So then there's the governmental theory of atonement. This is very similar to penal substitution. Probably the biggest difference is it focuses more on, rather than God being the one that's so angry at you, it would say, okay, so actually what is happening here is God is kind of handcuffed or beholden to his law. So there's a law and it has certain requirements, and God wishes that he didn't have to penalize you, right? Or in the governmental model, it also could be consequential, meaning like, all right, so let me explain the difference between penalty and consequence. So in the governmental model, you could have either it be a penalty or a consequence for your actions. So the law says don't go over the speed limit, and let's say then the judge punishes you because you went over the speed limit. The alternative to that is because you went over the speed limit, the law will allow for the things to happen to you that are going to happen to you, which will inevitably be death. Some of God's words in Genesis and in other places would be then seen as being predictive rather than descriptive. For example, maybe where God says to Adam and Eve, if you eat the forbidden fruit, you will surely die. One person can look at that and say, God will kill you. The other person could look at that and say, well, God will allow for you to die the death that you deserve. he's not going to be the one that kills you, but he's going to remove his hand of protection from you, and then you will die. So there are these two concepts that can come into play with the governmental theory, but it's largely focused on the law. The law being the reason why these things will come into play. And it has to do also with divine justice, maintaining that God is just and the justifier of sinners. But a lot of these models also believe in that God is just and the justifier of sinners. Okay, so then moving on into moral influence theory. So the moral influence theory is the idea that you aren't necessarily in need of legal help, you're in need of restoration. And the restoration that you receive can put you back in good standing. Meaning, what has happened is humanity has made the decision to leave God's principles and laws and to live a life contrary to that. But what Christ did was he came and demonstrated what it's like to live according to God's laws. And he demonstrated what would happen if you chose not to live according to God's laws by dying upon the cross. Kind of like an example, if you will. An example of what will happen if you reject God's laws and you reject God's love and you reject God's ways. You will die. Kind of focused on the consequential, way of viewing things. Well, the moral influence of Christ is to say, but if you keep God's laws, if you follow Christ, and even if you allow him, they believe, that he can help in the transformation of your life, but that God's power and his love and these things are transformative, and that Christ is a good moral influence. He influences your morals so that you can be restored to the person that you were designed to be. Again, some of these are like, well, I don't disagree with the idea that Christ can restore us and that he can transform us, and that God will send his Holy Spirit to develop us and change us and grow us, for sure. Was the death of Christ, was it only exemplary? Was it only to show us what would happen if we reject God or if we don't follow his ways? Well, that's a bigger question. So again, each one of these, there's definitely reasons why people believe these. Reasons why we would adopt these models, and then reasons why we would let them go. So that's pretty much an overview of the theories. I want to focus in on the penal substitution theory. And the reason I want to focus in on the penal substitution theory is because, again, as a Protestant, this is largely the most believed, but it's also the most under attack currently. Since the last 100 or so years, essentially this model has been under attack by another model that I didn't mention, which is a Christus Victor model. The Christus Victor model is very similar to the ransom model, and it essentially says that Christ won, that there is a battle taking place between God and Satan, and Christ is the victor over all the things, all the ways and things, and all the things that we are under, that we've been captured by, or taken hold of, or we're slaves to. That's probably the best language. That Christ is victorious over this, and he sets us free from those things, and he establishes a whole new kingdom and a way of being. So probably it's most similar, but it is its own thing, and it comes a little bit later on, even though I don't see it in these Wikipedia things. It is definitely a well-known model of atonement. So the Christus Victor believers, specifically, let's see, I think his name, down here, the Christ Victor theory, the rescue of humanity from the power of sin and death, a view popularized by Gustav Aulin. He took aim at the penal substitution theory. Quite strong aim, And now, largely, this is believed by liberal Christianity. And I don't say that word to be like, I'm not trying to be offensive to liberal or progressive Christians. I don't think that they would take offense to the concept that they believe in this view over and against the penal substitution model. But that is primarily the people who believe in it. Now, oddly, the penal substitution folks also would adopt the Christus Victor model. Most of them would agree that this is a true biblical model. They would just say it's not the primary model. They would say that penal substitution is the primary model. And so penal substitution, let's read it, is the theory that teaches that Jesus suffered, let me just highlight it real quick. Jesus suffered the penalty due according to God the Father's wrath for humanity's sins. Are you following? Christ suffered the penalty. The penalty is something that is done to somebody for breaking the law. Who's it done by? It's done by God. Why is it done by God? Because God is angry over humanity's sins, or all sin for that matter. Penal substitution derives from the idea that divine forgiveness, in order for God to forgive, he must satisfy divine justice. So God can't forgive unless justice is satisfied. That is, God is not willing or able to, and there's a difference there, but we're not going to get into the weeds. Some say God, was not willing to. Others say God was not able to. And then a lot of that comes back to that governmental theory. Is God able to, or is he handcuffed by his own law? He's not willing or able to forgive sin without first requiring a satisfaction for it. So God requires, his wrath to be satisfied. And it needs to be satisfied by what was required, the penalty due for breaking his law and for going against him. All right, now there's some other points to this, but I think what I want to do at this point is I want to point out to you the criticisms and the replies to those criticisms. So there's some really strong criticisms against this model. Some of them I think are really valid. And there have been some good answers to those criticisms as well. And you can find a lot of those answers from more recent scholars, one of which is William Lane Craig. He's really well known for answering some of these criticisms more recently. So number one, perfect satisfaction for sin, even by way of substitution, leaves no room for divine forgiveness or pardon. What does this mean? This means that if I owe you, like let's say I steal $2 from you, and you say you owe me $2, and I come back and I give you the $2, then that's not forgiveness, that's satisfaction. I have satisfied the demands that you have over your money. And let's say I give you $4. So let's say that that's perfect satisfaction. Well, by giving you $4, that means that I've more than compensated for what was required. And this is not forgiveness. Forgiveness is when I owe you $2 and you say to me, I forgive you of your owing me those $2. It's like you take the debt upon yourself. Now, of course, you can already see the argument against this, and that is that if God was the one to take the debt upon himself, then he is offering forgiveness. That must mean that Christ is God. All right. Without Christ being God, then he does not meet the requirements of being able to offer forgiveness. Okay. So then number two, it's unjust both to punish the innocent and to allow the guilty to go free. This is a very big accusation by Muslims to Christians. It is unjust both to punish the innocent. Is it unjust to punish an innocent person? Absolutely. Well, that's what, in this model, God does to Christ. God punishes Christ for the sins of you and I. So that's an unjust thing. So God is acting unjustly. And it's unjust to allow the guilty to go free, so that Christ actually is able to walk away and go free from not Christ, I'm sorry, you and I are able to walk away and go free from something that we've done wrong, when really we are guilty for what we have done wrong. And this is another really good, strong accusation. And there's a variety of ways that people have answered this question. And I'm not going to answer this one specifically until another video, a future video. So if you want to hear an answer to this in the future, check out the next video when I talk about Adventist soteriology specifically. What does soteriology mean? It means the study of salvation. So, number 3, the finite suffering and temporary death of one is disproportionate to the infinite suffering and permanent death of many. Now, I actually fully agree with this one, and this is something that I would personally leverage against the penal substitution model. The finite suffering and death, temporary death of Christ, that's the one. Christ died, and then he rose again, and now he stands in glory. Well, this was a moment in time. This was what was it? 3 days he was dead. He suffered. Let's say that he suffered his whole life on earth. That's, somewhere in 30 couple years that he was on earth, and then he suffered this death. But this was disproportionate to the infinite suffering and permanent death of many. Many Christians believe in something called eternal conscious torment, ECT, eternal conscious torment. And you should look this up. This is very important, especially if you believe in it, because you need to understand what it is and why you believe in it. The idea that for all of eternity, for all of eternity, there will be a group of people and angels and angelic beings, fallen angels, the devil and his demons, that will be tormented, all right? They will be, experience the fires of hell. So torment, physical, mental anguish, right? Both physical and mental anguish. Some believe only in physical, some believe only in mental, but physical, mental anguish for all of eternity. Now, and they won't like, oh, it hurts so bad, lose consciousness. No, they will be conscious the whole time, meaning that they will always be conscious of this incredible pain for all of eternity. That's what eternal conscious torment is. Burned with fire for all of eternity, or something of the sort. All right, so do you believe this? If you do, that's one major reason why many people leave Christianity, because they can't reconcile God being a God of love, which Christians claim he is, with the idea that God is going to perform something called ECT for all of eternity. It's hard to reconcile those in the mind of anybody, including Christians. And I've had experiences where I've asked Christian scholars, do you believe this? Well, how is this true? And they don't have answers. They do not have answers. Nobody can answer this question. How is this true? How can you reconcile that God is a God of love and at the same time that God will torture people for all of eternity while they remain conscious? Well, their answer is usually this. We don't have the answers to everything. I don't know everything. I just know that the Bible says God is love and God will do this, so I believe it. Well, watch a movie called, Edward Fudge. Hell and Edward Fudge. Edward Fudge and Hell. All right. Oh, Hell and Mr. Fudge. Mr. Fudge, I don't remember what it's called. Look it up. Edward Fudge is the guy who wrote a book. He was a very scholarly guy who wrote on this. But I'll talk more about this later as well, and what I believe regarding this topic and how it can be answered. And then number 4, the grace of perfect satisfaction would appear to confer on its beneficiaries a freedom to sin without consequence. What does this mean? This means that if you receive a forgiveness, a perfect satisfaction, meaning all of the sins that you have committed, will commit, and will commit in the future, if Christ has paid for those things and you have been forgiven of those things, all right, and specifically I would even add to this that you have been sealed so that you cannot lose your salvation, so you're eternally secure as soon as you receive Christ, then it doesn't matter what sins you commit in the future because they've already been paid for. So you have a license essentially to go on sinning. This is what many people have accused Christians of being, believing in cheap grace. You just believe in Jesus, you say the moment in time in which you accepted Christ as your personal Savior, and then you can go on sinning. So these are some serious accusations that have been leveraged against penal substitution? Of course, the answer to this, number 4, which I will give you, again, we're going to deal with 2 and 3 in a later video, but number 4 is that Christians do not believe that if you have been given grace, then you've been given a license to go on sinning. Of course, they don't believe that you can go on sinning. Of course, you should stop sinning. In fact, they would go so far as to say, true Christians that have truly been converted will have fruits that reflect their conversion. They will be so thankful for being forgiven their debts and their sins that what they will do is they will demonstrate that in their life by the way that they live, and their fruits will show this. They will live a life that looks like a Christian life. Probably Galatians chapter 5 is a good example of this. The fruits of the Spirit will be part of their life. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that as well. So those are the models of atonement within the theories of atonement, some of the major ones within Christianity. And these are some of the accusations, and I've shared with you the criticisms, and I've answered 2 of those major criticisms, giving you the replies to them. You can look on this Wikipedia article here about penal substitution and look further into the replies, or you can get a book by William Lane Craig that discusses this further at length. And it doesn't jump off the page at me immediately, but he has one, and there's others. There's many others that have dealt with some of the accusations against penal substitution. In fact, here's what I'll do. I'll just go like this. The Atonement. That's what the book is called. One book that you could potentially buy on this. All right, God bless you. Stick around for number 2. There's going to be another video that's coming up where I'm going to be talking about what is Adventist soteriology. Are they crazy? Do they believe the same things that other Christians believe about atonement, or do they believe things that are untrue? Do they believe in a model of atonement that is unlike other Christians? Where do they stand on penal substitution? Where do they stand on all the models of atonement? Well, stick around, come back for video number 2, and you can get the answers to those questions. And I'm going to show you exactly how Adventists think, Seventh-day Adventists. Where do they get their ideas, and how do they think? All right, God bless you.